My mom promised to help pay for college if I got a scholarship. When I got a full ride, she said, I changed my mind and bought my brother a car instead. 4 years later, she's begging me to pay her medical bills. I was 17 when my mom sat me down at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and that serious look she got when she meant business. She said if I could get a scholarship, any scholarship, she'd help me pay for the rest of college expenses like room and board, books, everything I needed to succeed. I remember feeling this surge of hope because college seemed impossible on my minimum wage job at the grocery store. My dad had left when I was 12, and my mom worked double shifts as a nurse just to keep us afloat. Money was always tight, but she promised me this one thing, this chance at a better life. My younger brother Caleb was sitting right there eating cereal, and my mom looked at him too. She said the same deal applied to both of us, whoever worked hard enough to earn it. Caleb just shrugged and went back to his phone, but I felt like my whole future had just opened up. That night, I stayed up until 3 a.m. researching scholarships, writing down deadlines, figuring out what I needed to do. I printed out applications and stacked them on my desk like they were treasure maps leading to my escape from our small town. Senior year became a blur of studying, volunteering, and working extra shifts to save money while keeping my grades perfect. I joined every club that looked good on applications. I wrote essays about overcoming adversity and helping others. I spent weekends at the library because our internet was too slow at home. My friends were out partying while I was crafting scholarship essays and filling out financial aid forms until my hand cramped. Every rejection letter felt like a punch to the gut, but I kept going because I had my mom's promise holding me up. Then in March, I got the call that changed everything. The university admissions office told me I'd received a full academic scholarship covering tuition, fees, and even a meal plan. It was one of only 15 given out statewide that year. I remember dropping the phone and just standing there in shock before running to find my mom. She was in the laundry room folding towels, and when I told her, she hugged me so tight I could barely breathe. She said she was proud of me, that I'd earned this, that she'd help me with everything else just like she promised. The next few weeks were incredible. I felt like I was walking on air everywhere I went. My teachers congratulated me. My boss at the grocery store said I was going places. Even people around town who barely knew me were saying how proud they were. My mom kept telling her coworkers about my scholarship, and I could hear the pride in her voice. She started looking at dorm furniture online and talking about driving me to campus in the fall. I felt like finally everything was falling into place. That's when Caleb decided he wanted a car. Not just any car, but this specific red sports car he'd seen at the dealership downtown. It was used but still cost $18,000, way more than we'd ever spent on anything. He just graduated high school with a C average and no plans beyond working at his friend's dad's auto shop. But suddenly he was obsessed with this car, talking about it constantly, showing my mom pictures on his phone every day. At first, my mom said no. We couldn't afford it. And besides, she'd already committed to helping me with college expenses. But Caleb kept pushing. He said all his friends had cars, that he needed reliable transportation for work, that it wasn't fair I was getting so much money for college when he was getting nothing. He started calling me the favorite, saying mom loved me more, making these dramatic speeches about feeling left out of the family. I should have seen it coming, but I was so focused on preparing for college that I missed the signs. My mom started getting quiet when I talked about dorm stuff. She stopped looking at bedding sets online. When I showed her the list of things I'd need for my dorm room, she just nodded and said we'd figure it out later. I thought she was just stressed about money, which was normal for us. I never imagined she was planning to break the promise that had motivated me through my entire senior year. The conversation happened on a Wednesday evening in June. I was sitting at that same kitchen table where she'd made her promise, working through my course registration paperwork, when she sat down across from me. She had that look again, but this time it made my stomach drop instead of filling me with hope. She said she'd been thinking about the college situation, and she'd realized she couldn't help me financially after all. The money just wasn't there, she said, and I was smart enough to figure it out on my own. I stared at her in complete shock. I reminded her about the promise she'd made, about how I'd worked for this moment for over a year. She waved her hand dismissively and said things change, that promises made to children don't always work out. Then she hit me with the real punch to the gut. She'd decided to help Caleb buy that car instead because he needed it for work. And boys need reliable transportation more than girls need college luxuries. Those were her exact words, that my college expenses were luxuries while his car was a necessity. The worst part was how casually she said it, like she was telling me we were out of milk. I asked her how she could possibly think a sports car was more important than my education, and she got defensive. She said I was being selfish and ungrateful, that I should be happy about my scholarship instead of demanding more. She said family helps family, and Caleb was family too. When I pointed out that I was also family and she'd made me a promise, she said I was being dramatic and manipulative. I felt like the ground had disappeared under my feet. Everything I'd planned, everything I'd worked for, suddenly seemed impossible. The scholarship covered tuition and meals, but I still needed money for textbooks, supplies, clothes, transportation, and 1,000 other things. I'd been counting on working part-time and having my mom's help to make it work. Without her support, I'd have to take out massive loans or work so many hours that my grades would suffer. That Saturday, I watched through the living room window as my mom and Caleb drove off to the dealership. They came back 3 hours later with him behind the wheel of that red sports car, grinning like he'd won the lottery. My mom looked proud as she watched him show off for the neighbors, and I realized she'd probably been planning this betrayal for weeks. The car payment was going to be $400 a month for 5 years, money that could have easily covered my college expenses. The betrayal hit me in waves over the next few days. Every time I saw that car in our driveway, every time Caleb revved the engine or washed it in the street, I felt sick to my stomach. My mom kept trying to act normal, asking about my classes and talking about the fall like nothing had changed. When I brought up needing help with textbook money, she said I should get a job, completely ignoring the fact that I'd been working since I was 15 and had already been planning to work in college. My friends started asking why I seemed depressed when I should be excited about college. I couldn't bring myself to tell them the truth, that my own mother had chosen my brother's want over my need, that she'd broken the promise that had motivated me through the hardest year of my life. I felt embarrassed and ashamed, like somehow I'd failed to earn what she'd promised me. I started avoiding family gatherings because I couldn't stand watching Caleb show off his car while my mom beamed with pride. By July, the reality of my situation was sinking in. I applied for every possible loan and grant, worked extra shifts at the grocery store, and started buying generic everything to save money. I sold my guitar, my bike, and most of my clothes to build up a small emergency fund. I was determined to make college work with or without my mother's help, but the stress was eating me alive. I barely slept, constantly worried about having enough money to make it through the first semester. When August came, my mom offered to drive me to campus like nothing had happened. I told her I'd find my own way, and she looked hurt. She said I was being stubborn and childish, that I should let her help even if she couldn't contribute money. I couldn't believe she had the audacity to act wounded when she was the one who'd broken her promise. I took the bus to campus with 2 suitcases and a backpack, feeling more alone than I'd ever felt in my life. College was everything I'd dreamed of and more, but the financial stress never went away. I worked 20 hours a week in the library, took on tutoring jobs, and lived on ramen noodles and peanut butter sandwiches. My classmates talked about care packages from home and family visits, while I counted every penny and worried about making rent. I called home once a week out of obligation, but the conversations were stilted and awkward. My mom always asked how I was doing with money, and I always said I was fine. Meanwhile, Caleb's car became the family's pride and joy. My mom posted pictures of it on social media with captions about how proud she was of her son's first big purchase. She never mentioned that she'd co-signed the loan and was making most of the payments. When relatives asked about my college experience, she'd changed the subject to Caleb's job at the auto shop and how responsible he was becoming. It was like my achievements had become invisible the moment she decided to prioritize his wants. Sophomore year, I found out through my cousin that Caleb had been fired from the auto shop for showing up late repeatedly, and that my mom was now making the entire car payment. He was working part-time at a fast food restaurant and spending most of his free time partying with friends. The car that had been so essential for his work was now just an expensive toy that my mom couldn't afford. When I called her about it, she got defensive and said boys mature at different rates, that Caleb would find his way eventually. I graduated summa cum laude with a degree in accounting and immediately landed a job at a prestigious firm in the state capital. I'd managed to keep my student loans relatively low through scholarships, grants, and working constantly, but I still owed $30,000. My mom came to graduation and acted proud, taking pictures and bragging to other parents about my success. She seemed to have completely forgotten that she'd nearly derailed my entire future over a sports car. After graduation, I moved 4 hours away and rarely came home. I sent birthday cards and called on holidays, but I kept my distance emotionally and financially. My mom would hint about needing help with bills or mention how expensive Caleb's car payment was, but I pretended not to understand. I was building my own life and my own emergency fund, determined never to depend on anyone else's promises again. 3 years into my career, I got promoted to senior accountant and bought my own house. It was small but perfect, with a garden in the back and a home office where I could work on freelance projects. I felt proud of what I'd accomplished completely on my own, without any help from the family that had abandoned me when I needed them most. I started dating someone wonderful, made great friends at work, and built a life that had nothing to do with my hometown or the people who'd broken their promises to me. That's when my mom got sick. At first, it was just some concerning symptoms that she mentioned in passing during our brief phone calls. Fatigue, some pain, nothing that seemed too serious. But over the course of a few months, the symptoms got worse, and the tests started showing problems. Cancer, stage 3, treatable, but expensive. Her insurance would cover most of it, but the copays and out-of-pocket expenses were going to be substantial. I found out the full extent of the situation when she called me crying one evening in October. Her savings were already depleted from covering Caleb's various expenses over the years, including several car repairs, insurance claims, and his rent when he'd been unemployed. She'd been counting on her retirement account to get her through, but early withdrawal penalties and medical bills were eating through it faster than she'd anticipated. She needed help, and she was calling to ask if I could contribute to her medical expenses. The conversation felt surreal. This was the same woman who'd told me that family helps family while she was breaking her promise to help me with college. Now she was invoking that same phrase, asking me to step up when she needed support. I felt a mixture of anger, sadness, and bitter vindication. Part of me wanted to hang up the phone and let her figure it out the same way she'd forced me to figure out college on my own. But I couldn't do it. Despite everything, she was still my mother, and I wasn't going to let her suffer because of old resentments. I told her I'd think about it and call her back. That night, I sat in my kitchen, staring out at the garden I'd planted myself, thinking about promises and family and what we owe each other. I thought about the 18-year-old girl who'd had to rebuild her entire future when the people she trusted most let her down. I called her back the next day with conditions. I would help with her medical expenses, but first we needed to have an honest conversation about what had happened when I was in high school. I wanted her to acknowledge that she'd broken her promise to me and explain why she'd prioritized Caleb's car over my education. I wasn't looking for an apology necessarily, but I needed her to recognize what she'd done and how it had affected me. The conversation was painful for both of us. My mom tried to minimize what had happened at first, saying I'd turned out fine anyway and that dwelling on the past wasn't productive. But I pushed back, explaining how her betrayal had nearly derailed my future and had definitely damaged our relationship permanently. I told her about the stress, the financial struggles, the feelings of abandonment and betrayal that had shaped my entire college experience. Eventually, she broke down and admitted that she'd made a terrible mistake. She said she'd let Caleb manipulate her, that she'd been afraid of his anger and emotional outbursts more than she'd been worried about disappointing me. She said she'd assumed I was strong enough to succeed without help, while Caleb seemed like he needed more support and guidance. It wasn't fair, she admitted, and she'd regretted it almost immediately, but had been too proud to admit she was wrong. I helped her with the medical bills, but our relationship never fully recovered. I kept my financial contributions businesslike and impersonal, paying specific invoices rather than giving her cash she could spend on other things. When she asked for help with non-medical expenses, I declined. When she suggested that Caleb should contribute too, I pointed out that he was still making payments on the car she'd helped him buy instead of helping me with college. Caleb never did contribute meaningfully to our mother's care. The sports car eventually got repossessed when he couldn't keep up with payments and insurance after a minor accident. He moved back home and worked various jobs, but never seemed to grasp that his actions had consequences, or that family obligations went both ways. My mom still made excuses for him, saying he was going through a rough patch and needed patience and understanding. 2 years later, my mom was in remission and doing well. I was engaged to be married and had been promoted again at work. When she asked if she could help with wedding expenses, I politely declined. When she seemed hurt by my refusal, I reminded her that I'd learned to handle major life expenses on my own, thanks to the lesson she'd taught me senior year of high school. Our relationship today is cordial but distant. She's proud of my success, but doesn't seem to fully understand that her broken promise fundamentally changed how I view family loyalty and trust. I love her, but I also learned that I can't depend on her, and that lesson has shaped every major decision I've made since I was 18. Sometimes the most important thing a parent teaches you is that you can only truly rely on yourself.